This is Monica Perez, and this is the second half, the final half of the final chapter of The Makers of the Modern Mind. So this is, I don't know what, part 24. There's also kind of a lengthy conclusion. I'll do this again next week so we get the conclusion. And my friends Scott and William, whose podcast I rarely dare to name because I hate it so much, but I want you to know where it's going to be because they invited me on to talk about this, is the History Homos podcast. And we are going to talk about this on Saturday. So it'll probably be available by coincidence, really, right after the conclusory conversation that we have. So if you want to listen to it, you're going to have to go there. Maybe I'll put a highlight reel on my premium feed, but I like to drive people to their stuff. It's very interesting. The reason it has such an awful name is because it's comedy, but it's very, and it is quite comical. So I really like that show. And we're going to talk about this. I'm going to finish this today. It's Dewey. The second part is Dewey. And then after this, before I launch into another giant book, I'm probably going to read a smaller book. Like I was thinking of this one, The Deadly Deception, Freemasonry Exposed, by Jim Shaw. It's a real classic. Or maybe I read this, The Case of the Midwife Toad by Arthur Kessler. It's how Paul Kammerer disproved Darwin in 1925, and I think got suicided to pay for that. And then even if I do a longer book, I may do like a highlight reel of a book. So some of these books are really bulky, and maybe I'll go through the extra effort of reading in advance and just reading the best bits to use. So anyway, we'll continue the series. I'm throwing that out there for you so you know what's coming. Feel free to email me or whatever, monicaperezshow@gmail.com if you've got ideas. And also this week, if you're listening to this later in time, it's probably going to be not true, but we do it often enough. This Wednesday at 11 a.m., we're doing the Cognitive Dissidence Zoom call with premium subscribers. So if you join me if you subscribe to me, Hervoye, or Parallel Mike on Substack, or even iTunes, you can get the access code for that. It's Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. Well, enough of that. Let's hit it. So this is the second half of Dewey, section 5. By the very nature of things, Dewey's philosophy. Did we talk about how this is not Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System? Not the same guy. Okay. By the very nature of things, Dewey's philosophy turns out to be largely concerned with ethics and other social considerations, which are only a side problem with most previous philosophers. His inquiry always starts with a social problem, and its aim is to clarify and solve the problem. To consider his, quote, social philosophy, therefore, is to take in the whole compass of his thought. But we can describe briefly what he has said about the long-standing problems of the individual and society: progress, socialism, religion, and other such matters. Dewey believed that the failure of past philosophies to answer the demanding questions put by depressions, wars, bad education, and other social problems is an indictment of their worth and perhaps even of human intelligence. Philosophy for him is scientific inquiry into social problems. Logic and such other branches of philosophy, which are not directly concerned with social problems, are inquiries into methods of thinking and are to social philosophy what tool-making crafts are to industrial production. Dewey insists that in social thinking, programs cannot be determined in advance. Inquiry has no predetermined end, but rather like a game of treasure hunt, it follows each clue turned up in the search, not knowing what the treasure will be, but knowing that progress is made as each step is taken. Or, to switch metaphors, someone has compared Dewey's social philosophy to a party of young people aboard a bus who shout, "We don't know where we're going, but we're on our way." The vehicle which transports us is, quote, free social inquiry indissolubly wedded to the art of full and moving communication. Free inquiry, discussion, debate, and publication, he believes, will remove ignorance and drive prejudice and superstition out of public places. For Dewey puts full faith in intelligence and in the fruitfulness of communicated, shared experiences. In his writings on ethical subjects, Dewey shows himself opposed to any system of absolute values and to the traditional virtues treated by past philosophers, which he believes have been arrived at deductively. Yeah, remember Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote that very famous passage in like America in the Technotronic era or something like that, where he said there's an elite that's totally divorced from ethical considerations or traditional ethics. I guess this isn't consistent with that. Is consistent with that. Okay. He insists that values must undergo perpetual modification and reconstruction in the process of reflective thinking as social conditions change and scientific knowledge increases. For the older virtues, he would substitute wholehearted, persistent, impartial interest in the social good. In his own social milieu, Dewey believed the most important values are democracy, liberty of inquiry and expression of opinion, and freedom of action. Dewey's instrumentalism blurs the old distinctions between the individual and society and between various social groups. No thought or action can be purely personal, for everything acts and moves in conjunction with and in opposition to other things. Every event, including the formulation of a philosophy, occurs in the social matrix and therefore becomes social in nature. In his specifically social thought, Dewey can be called a modern liberal. He enthusiastically supported every so-called liberal cause throughout his lifetime and wrote an essay to explain why the old individualistic liberalism of the 19th century was dead and how the new liberalism meant cooperative control and large-scale social planning. The new liberalism has sometimes been called modified socialism and sometimes the welfare state. These are all capital. Liberalism, modified socialism, welfare state are all capitalized. Designations which Dewey would accept if they admitted freedom of inquiry and communication. He refused to be a Marxist on the same grounds that he refused to be a fascist, namely that both systems were unscientific, quote, solutions to the great social problems, and both rejected the freedoms required by the scientific method. Yeah, because they were all based on untruths, on removing incentive and human nature from the equation. So that's why they restrict freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought, freedom of discussion, because that would actually get you to the truth. That's why I remember somebody said that about like Catholicism being restrictive in thought. And I remember when I sent my kids to Catholic school, it was like a real hardcore Catholic school. They did two things that at first people would not expect, or it was just, I'll just tell you the two things. So one was you could say anything. I mean, I went to the principal and said, hey, that thing and like 21 Coptic Christians killed in Libya is a psyop. And she said, the Pope is praying for them. I said, yeah. And he should know better because he's got military intelligence just like the rest of the world. And I sent her evidence and she never mentioned it again. And I think she backed off on a lot of that stuff. So they were really open. You could always challenge because they absolutely had confidence in their truth. They were ready for the challenge. They wanted it. When you've got people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas behind you, you probably have more firepower than the person who's up against you, which does take some education on your part. I felt a little guilty because I read the other day, you have to be educated in matters of faith, you could extend to economics, politics, whatever is that you're going to defend. You have to actually be educated because people will challenge your beliefs and you can't forget why you came to that conclusion. You have to be able to defend them. Like we don't have enough to do. And then the other thing is, it's just an aside, but it was the kids, it was a tiny school, but it was near a big park. So they would do gym at the park, big park, like a complex kind of thing. And which I never had when I was a kid, and I went to Catholic school, and I wish I had because I was always scrambling for something to wear to gym. They had little gym uniforms. It was so cute. Their little blue shorts and white t-shirt and whatever. And I remember picking them up there once it was like at dismissal, and they happened to be at the park. So the kids came running, 100 kids, whatever, running towards us parents, all in the same outfits. And I just looked at the mom next to me and I said, you gotta be an individual under these circumstances. You gotta be your own person. It's like the exact opposite of covering yourself with tattoos and pink hair. Like, you have to actually have something to offer. And the mom next to me was like, yep. And it was true. You absolutely had to distinguish yourself. If you're all look alike and you have freedom of expression and freedom of thought and communication and inquiry, it just, I think, elevates the intellectual game and humor too. A lot of things came out of that. Anyway, just some thoughts about freedom and Marxism. All right. Here we go. In religion, Dewey broke sharply from traditional Western thinking. For like Bentham and the utilitarians, he could not accept religious thought in his system, since belief in God or knowledge of his attributes can never be part of experience as Dewey conceived it. That is why one of his disciples, writing in the issue of Progressive Education, that's the name of the magazine, dedicated to Dewey after his death in 1952, said his, quote, philosophy comes as a gospel of revolution. Occasional criticisms that emanate from non-scientific sources, he explains, make it clear that Dewey's philosophy is becoming widely regarded as a threat to the moral and spiritual values which we have inherited from the past. Yeah, you should think hard about that. Why did we inherit them? Why did your parents and their parents and everyone since the beginning of time? Because they couldn't think? They had no courage? Maybe not. Dewey opposed the established religions as survivals from a pre-scientific and pre-technological age, which had no place in modern society. Okay, if you're going to think that, that's where you start getting like the Big Bang and Darwin and all this made up stuff to try to eliminate the question that religion was determined. Excuse me. He's getting better. So, good boy. So, so they act like science answers these questions that religion supposedly emerged to answer in an unscientific way. But that stuff you're not getting that answer. Darwin's answer isn't true. There's a subcellular intelligence. There is a mechanism that communicates with the environment that they have not figured out. The Big Bang, I don't know what, but I don't even think they're supporting that anymore. And what difference did it make? It came out of nowhere. Science isn't answering that question. Anyway, the book goes on. They are social fossils, so to speak, made up of it. Fossils are fake. No, some fossils are real. Mammoths are real. And T-Rexes, I don't think so. All right. Made up of outmoded dogmas, unscientific moral teaching, and superstitious practices. Whatever. I could go on, but I'm not. You get it. But Dewey does not spend much time on organized religions, for he believes that they have long since been discredited and will soon disappear from the social scene. One of his students explains how Dewey advised them not to try reforming or reconstructing religion, but to acquiesce cheerfully in its demise. This student goes on to say that Dewey was less outspokenly anti-religious than most of his associates at Columbia University. But like all of them, I was going to say hi to Harry, and I lost my place. But like all of them, he treated religion as a survival of an earlier period in mental evolution. A naturalistic philosophy which accepts only experience must reject any belief in the supernatural. This Dewey clearly saw. Quote, mankind has hardly inquired, he wrote, what would happen if the possibility of experience were seriously explored and exploited. Religions have been saturated with the supernatural, and the supernatural signifies precisely that which lies beyond experience. Moral codes have been allied to this religious supernaturalism and have sought their foundation and sanction in it. Contrast with such ideas, deeply embedded in all Western culture, gives the philosophy of faith and experience a definite and profound meaning. Dewey's indictment of supernaturalism is that it is intellectually false and morally vicious, vice-filled, whatever. More specifically, he charges it with trying to regulate conduct with dogmas rather than the understanding of actual conditions. Yeah, but I think it is. It is consistent with actual conditions, with human nature and the temptations and the consequences. I mean, take the taboos against premarital sex or incest or whatever. You think that's not based in science? Even the kosher stuff was like about mixing cheese and like getting it into the wooden plates, I think. Anyway, yeah. So I've always thought you can back into all these moral rules just from the consequences. And that's why I feel like in the long run, if you eliminated the like mala prohibited laws, the prohibitions in law, the consequences of your actions would curb behavior. Right now, if you become a drug addict, you get welfare. This happened to my sister. She died with a needle in her arm. She got welfare. She got a ride to the methadone clinic. She never had to feel the consequences. She had been a nurse, which probably, who knows, she might have done that for bad reasons, but she was good at it. And she had a job. And then when she didn't have to work anymore, she didn't. But she was able-bodied, like, except for she started getting nutty because she did so many drugs. I'm just saying, the consequences are what will give rise to moral behavior. It's the enabling. Watch My 600-Pound Life, and you'll find an enabler in there. And half the time they're on welfare. I saw one where the guy, skinny guy, he wanted to eat free, and he knew that her welfare got her enough food to maintain 600 pounds. And he wasn't going to help her stop. Anyway, that's one of the many reasons I think the welfare state is immoral. He says, he charges religion trying to regulate conduct with being incompatible with scientific inquiry and with democratic institutions and relationships, and with being philosophically untenable because its beliefs are a priori and immutable. That could be a good thing. They still haven't proven it wrong. Nevertheless, Dewey asserts in A Common Faith that there is a place for religion in modern society. It must learn to forego the apparatus of dogma and doctrine, break away from custom and tradition, and bind men together in a common fellowship to work for that's secular humanism, does not work, for better social conditions and the advancement of humanity. See, the reason I think that doesn't work is you really have to do stuff for the love of God, because people suck. We all suck. So if you're doing something Mother Teresa used to say, listen to the drunks. It's very hard if you didn't believe in God, feel like this guy did that to himself. And I don't want to waste my time doing that. I'd rather blah, blah, blah. It's the people who are so unlovable that you really have to go the extra mile. And in my experience, there's only one way to do that. And that's why that Ordo Amoris is not only the answer for God, but it's for us, like Ordo Amoris, like love God first and then love your neighbor as yourself. And which kind of gives you the order. And yeah, so I don't think secular humanism works, and I don't think it's meant to work. I think it's there just to funnel all the money, to get the tithing to go to the corrupt politicians. All right, it turns out that Dewey would like to replace the noun religion with the adjective religious to make it an attitude rather than a doctrine. This is an attitude or a quality in man which cannot be suppressed. True that. Rather, it should be utilized to promote social betterment and enlightened progress. Religion thus becomes a kind of social welfare agency and nothing more. Environmentalism has the earmarks of religion, as you no doubt have observed. All right, section 6. Dewey always maintained a lively interest in formal education. This was not an avocation, but part of his philosophical study. For the school is the laboratory in which philosophers can conduct their controlled experiments to verify their hypotheses and to obtain new data. Education is also the medium through which philosophy operates to reconstruct society. This is what Dewey has in mind when he tells us that philosophy is a general theory of education, and that his Democracy and Education is the book in which his philosophy was most fully expounded. Dewey's most widely read book, however, was his The School and Society, in which one finds the earliest exposition of what is loosely referred to as progressive education. Dewey's original purpose was to supply in the school certain elements of training and education that children no longer received at home or in the neighborhood. Back in Dewey's boyhood in Vermont, boys and girls engaged in a number of household and farmyard chores, worked with their hands, made and did things. Dewey believed that he learned more at these chores than he did in school. By the time he was teaching at Chicago University, he saw how industrialization had taken children out of household and neighborhood jobs, and thus he believed it took away from childhood training in habits of order and industry, acquaintance with the making of things by the transformation of raw materials into useful products. He further believed that in the modern industrial world, these things could be supplied only by the school. Wow, and this was probably while you still had moms who did not go to wage labor. The existing system of education, Dewey insisted, was a waste of human life. Unconcerned with the child's present, it pretended to prepare him for the future, but it failed even to do this. Quote, our present education is highly specialized, one-sided, and narrow, Dewey tells us. It is an education dominated almost entirely by the medieval conception of learning. It is something which appeals for the most part simply to the intellectual aspect of our natures, our desire to learn, to accumulate information, and to get control of the symbols of learning. Not to our impulses and tendencies to make, to do, to create, to produce, whether in the form of utility or of art. Education must undergo the same transformation society has undergone, and Dewey believed it must be an open affair, like his philosophy, which with no absolutes controlling it and no ends outside itself. Instrumentalist in philosophy, scientific in methodology, societal in purpose. The aim of education is given by Dewey in a number of ways. For one thing, it is to promote child growth in a social institution. For another, it is to affiliate the school with life, to make it a miniature society, an embryonic community. I have to say, I don't like it. And in my kids, because they went to that tiny school, it was less of a problem. But I always taught them, not because I like it, but because it's true. You're in an institution. Don't come home and tell me you don't like how it works. I mean, you can tell me and we can maybe find you a different place, but this is their system. You're there. This is a private school. You're there. You're opting in. And one of my kids went to a school that was not his cup of tea, but it had value. He recognized the value in it because it was had a good reputation for smart kids or good education. And he went and he just said, I'm opting in. And he never caused trouble. Oh, it was so painful during COVID with the masks and the tests. Oh, it was so awful. But he was opting in for a reason. And that's the story with institutions. Now, I didn't like that. And I want them to buy a farm, whatever. This guy, that's what he likes about it, that it's teaching people to conform. And I think that's the very essence of it. Okay. For one thing, it's to promote child growth in social institution. For another, it's to affiliate the school with life, make it a miniature society, an embryonic community. Yeah, but life, society, community is made up of adults. The children only tag along with the adults to check it out. And then there's a family. But I think John Taylor Gatto said, like, having 30 10-year-olds in one class is a very new invention, and it isn't actually a reflection of society at all. Again, in Dewey's words, quote, "The aim is the development of social power and insight. It is this liberation from narrow utilities, this openness to the possibilities of the human spirit, that makes these practical activities in the school allies of art and centers of science and history." Social power and insight. Is that why teachers encourage cliques and niches? Like kids. Yeah, I don't know. That's the worst part of it, in my opinion. All right, Deweyites and educationists have created an inner sanctum lingo of exciting terminology, which perplexes and confuses us who use words in their traditional sense and are used to thinking in traditional ways. But it does not seem unjust to say that behind all these avowed purposes of education is the ulterior aim of using the school system as a tool for social engineering so as to produce the kind of society which the Deweyites think we should have. Such an aim is consonant with Dewey's instrumentalist philosophy and with both the statements and the programs of many educationists. So this guy, this author, Neil, is pretty normy. You don't see him going down the rabbit hole too much, but he definitely sees the agenda behind the mumbo jumbo in this case. Dewey defines education as the process of experiencing. Again, he writes, education may be defined as a process of the continuous reconstruction of experience with the purpose of widening and deepening its social content, while at the same time the individual gains control of the methods involved. The school, at any rate, is to furnish the problems whose solution is imperiously demanded by the pupil's nature. The school is a social institution, a part of the total social process. Education is a social affair. Dewey writes at great length because the school must be a miniature of real life, which is social, because things have meaning only in their social setting, because the school is the means whereby society ensures its continuance and works for its improvement, and because education is best achieved by a sharing of experiences by the pupils. Education is therefore a function of society, and schools are the means whereby society performs this function. The school must therefore, to use educationist terminology, be in vital interaction with the surrounding natural and social environment. Classes should be taken on field trips through factories in the neighborhood. The students should take active part in cleanup campaigns, and the administration should be sensitive to social pressures and opinions in the neighborhood. I didn't think of that as like an idea. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. Seems okay to me. I don't know. Such relationship, although I understand what it's doing. I understand what it's doing. My father used to hate that. Community. He hated that. Such relationship requires educators to be committed to certain social institutions and to a program for a, quote, better society. For as Dewey has remarked, the conception of education as a social process and function has no definite meaning until we define the kind of society we have in mind. As we've already seen, Dewey favors democracy, something approaching a welfare state, which would still be an open society with a maximum of freedom for all. Dewey and his followers have been pronounced secularists. Hey, wait a second, though. His freedom of thought and communication and action, all of that, doesn't amount to a hill of beans if you've engineered the kids, if you've brainwashed them, if you've socially engineered them to conform, to comply, to have this viewpoint, to engage, to learn by practice how to live that viewpoint in your community. So I think he's social engineering the system with social engineering so he can achieve the goals that he wants, which, I mean, I don't think he'd even lie about that. Dewey and his followers have been pronounced secularists, and many of them have attempted to impose their secularism on the public schools as the, quote, American faith. At any rate, although instrumentalist philosophy holds that there can be no absolutes and that inquiry must proceed without an end in view, nevertheless, the social function of the school has required educators to accept certain social ideas as at least temporarily absolute. This education comes to be a form of social engineering. In his first work on education, Dewey insists that it is the business of everyone interested in education to insist upon the school as the primary and most effective interest of social progress and reform. The teacher is engaged not simply in the training of individuals, but in the formation of proper social life. In this way, the teacher always is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. End quote. Some educators have assumed the self-assigned burden of social engineering to, quote, recreate the student according to a social pattern of modern naturalism and secularism, which is to be perfectly, quote, neutral on all religious and moral questions. Thus, some of them have insisted that all children must be educated in the public school system and that private schools are dangerous and divisive. Others go so far as demand that children be in school all day, 12 months a year, which would obviously give educationists something close to a monopoly over all Americans' minds in their formative years. There's a footnote here. Some educators innocently and naively advocate this program following the businessman school of thought, which holds that classrooms should be utilized to the full. Others advocate it in order to control their students' lives completely. Dewey had many things to say about the school itself, its organization, curriculum, and physical facilities. And many of his observations were very shrewd criticisms of shortcomings in the older system. He opposed memory work and the forced accumulation of information about matters that were of no personal interest for the student. He insisted that since knowledge is an active affair, every school must be an activity school in which the students learn by doing. The basic reform in this respect is the replacement of the old subject-centered education, to which all students had to conform, with a, quote, child-centered education, to which the curriculum and all other educational paraphernalia must conform. Now, the change which is coming into our education, he wrote in The School and Society, is the shifting of the center of gravity. It is a change, a revolution, not unlike that introduced by Copernicus when the astronomical center shifted from the Earth to the sun. In this case, the child becomes the sun about which the appliances of education revolve. He is the center about which they are organized. There was undeniable need for reform in the older method of education, but unfortunately, Dewey and even more his followers threw the baby out with the bathwater. Dewey made it clear he had no intention of pandering to every student whim in concentrating on subjects which would interest him, nor did he intend to turn schools into mere mechanical workshops at the expense of intellectual activity. But he took the first step in this direction, and many of his educationists' followers have rushed headlong in the direction he first indicated, with results we all know too well. Courses in how to pick your dentist, how to do parlor stunts, what to do on a date, and other such social musts in place of Cicero, trigonometry, medieval history, and other older subjects supposedly barren of student interest. Well, I'm here to tell you, and this is what John Taylor Gatto said, these fancy high schools still teach that stuff. Very tiny, tiny amount. But John Taylor Gatto said, I think he said something like 80 of the 100 senators went to one of 5 high schools. And he could list them off, and they taught you these like 14 things. John Taylor Gatto's stuff is very, very interesting. He wrote a book, Dumbing Us Down, but also the one, what was her name? Charlotte Iserbyt. Iserbyt something. She was in Reagan's education department, and she was the one whose father was in Skull and Bones, and she released the list. She had a list of all the names. She wrote a book also called Dumbing Us Down, but John Taylor Gatto's excellent, well worth reading. Dewey did not personally advocate such specific courses, but he lived to see them employed, and As far as we know, he did not repudiate them. They seem logical applications of what he wrote about curriculum in My Pedagogic Creed. Here he gives us the principles for organizing the curriculum rather than drawing up a course of studies himself. The only way to make the child, I'm telling you, I think the core curriculum is like Dewey, whatever, 10 generations later. The only way to make, this is a quote. Well, Harry's telling me Ezerbit. Okay. The next one, how am I going to pronounce that? Klychek? I don't even know who that is, but I definitely can't pronounce it. Klyczek. Yeah. Okay. This is a quote. The only way to make the child conscious of his social heritage is to enable him to perform those fundamental types of activity which make civilization what it is. This includes such things as sewing, cooking, and manual training. But Dewey goes on to warn us, quote, there is no succession of studies in the ideal school curriculum. If education is life, all life has from the outset a scientific aspect, an aspect of art and culture, and an aspect of communication. It cannot therefore be true that the proper studies of one grade are mere reading and writing, and that at a later grade reading or literature or science may be introduced. The progress is not in the succession of studies, but in the development of new attitudes towards and new interests in experience. They had to specify that they wanted this all to happen in schools and public schools, because this sounds exactly like what our homeschooling mom, Jill, said about how she did it. She didn't, she found the whole rigmarole of the regimentation of the school oppressive to herself and to her kids. So she homeschooled in order for this stuff to happen. I had people call the radio show who would say, yeah, we get up in the morning, the kids come with me, they help me, and we go places and we see cool stuff. And then we get together and play like travel soccer or whatever, so that we can have the team experience, social experience. But I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur or like could do things that weren't structured. I now that I'm older, I realize, looking back, if I knew then what I know now, I could totally do it. But some people are just, it comes naturally. And this is the kind of thing that I think makes the homeschooling so delightful. And you can do it all. Just teach them how to read, and you don't have to, I don't know. There's so many reviews already written, and there's just so much you can allow them to do on their own, and then they would be lifetime learners. So maybe I'll convince one of my kids to let me raise their kids that way. Wouldn't that be fun? Section 7. Section 7. We're winding down here. So philosophers and educators may disagree as to whether Dewey was a good or a bad influence on the modern mind, but they do not disagree about the quantity of his influence. It has been tremendous. How lasting it will be, we cannot yet know. But even after Dewey is repudiated, many of his ideas will live on and will have influenced later generations of thinkers. As has been the case with our other makers of the modern mind, we must qualify any consideration of Dewey's influence by remarking that he rode the intellectual tide of his time and voiced what, quote, oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. American education and American philosophy were changing in the direction he advocated even before he wrote and taught, and there were others who held his ideas quite similar to his. But the fact remains that Dewey crystallized these trends, expressed them, gave them direction, and developed a school of disciples as none of his contemporaries succeeded in doing. It is difficult to assess Dewey's influence accurately because we are in the midst of it and cannot observe it from the outside as we can that of Descartes or Darwin. Moreover, many of Dewey's ideas have been taken for granted. Thus, a college student sitting in the informal type classroom or the parent who visits his child's school is not likely to realize that the physical arrangements in these classrooms derive from educational ideas first proposed by John Dewey. On the other hand, it would be naive to assume that if Dewey had never got out of his father's grocery store, the old authoritarian system of education would have persisted without modification. There is no danger of exaggeration in saying that Dewey's influence on education has been tremendous, both for good and for bad. As has been the case with our other makers of the modern mind, Dewey's disciples from Teachers College at Columbia University carried out his ideas with an extremism and a simplicity of which he would never be guilty. His influence was perhaps strongest during the epidemic of progressive education in the 1920s. Oh, it must have been heartbreaking because those were people who still had their heads screwed on straight, and to see their kids, I'm sure it snuck up on them like the phones did with us, on my kids. Since then, there has been a tempering of extreme progressivism in many quarters, with the best of it being salvaged and some of its naive ideas discarded. Dewey's influence is strong in curriculum modification, which has proceeded throughout most American schools, sometimes sound psychologically, but frequently bad educationally. It has influenced an increase of pupil activity in the classroom and an end in extracurricular affairs, in administrative organization along, quote, teacher participation, democratic lines, and in the physical construction of schools to make them embryonic communities. I remember I had a babysitter once. She was a teacher, like a preschool teacher, some kind of teacher during the day, and she would come after school. Briefly, I had her for like a week or two. And Obama had just been elected. This was in Atlanta. And she said, I'm leaving. I'm quitting my job. I'm moving to Washington, D.C. because, like Michelle Obama says, we want to get teachers out of the classroom and up to D.C. And I'm like, get the teachers out of the classroom? What are you talking about? I always thought that was crazy. Anyway, Dewey's influence has not been either so widespread or so marked in philosophy as in education, but it has not been negligible. Philosophers are not as apt as educationists to live by slogans and to follow a leader blindly. They are tough-minded men as a rule and become disciples only grudgingly. But some of America's most prominent philosophers today can be classed fairly enough as followers of John Dewey. Moreover, even those who do not accept his instrumentalism have been influenced by him to make their philosophy relevant to the problems of the day. But Dewey's greatest influence may in time be seen to have been on the general American scene, on the journals and the schools where public opinion is formed. The noted philosopher Sidney Hook spoke of the fresh perspectives of Dewey's thought and added that there is hardly a phase of American thought to which he has not made some contribution, hardly an aspect of American life which he has left uninterpreted. His influence has extended to the schools, the courts, the laboratories, the labor movement, and the politics of the nation. Those who are less enthusiastic than Hook about the worth Dewey's thought will likely still agree with him on its having permeated American thinking almost as a perfume or an odor permeates a room. Dewey is one American who has had considerable influence abroad. He was invited to Japan and to China after World War I, where he lectured and acted as educational advisor. He visited Mexico and Russia in the same capacity, and an attempt was made to utilize his ideas in Turkey. In each, a new government pledged to reconstruction and progress felt that American ideas, as worked out by Dewey, offered the most promising prospect of remaking their lands. Dewey extended his influence abroad, not only through personal visits, but even more by teaching thousands of foreigners who came to Teachers College, for these were men destined to be ministers of education or superintendents of school systems in their native countries. In his non-professional life, Dewey exemplified his philosophy of instrumentalism. Sorry, I have a kid problem. Hold on a sec. So, my oldest son, he's 22, but he has Down syndrome. So, I'm going to basically have a kid forever. It's super annoying. I mean, I love him, but it's like, all right already. I have to make sure he's waiting outside for his little school bus. Okay. He was active. All right. In his non-professional life, Dewey exemplified his philosophies of instrumentalism. He was active in many reform projects which aimed at reconstructing society along liberal lines. He helped form the first teachers union in New York City, was first president of the American Association of University Professors, participated actively in various presidential campaigns, took a definite stand on the issues involved in both world wars. I'd like to see his views on those. And in general, exerted his influence in America as an active citizen as well as a philosopher. In the last decades of his life, he was the elder statesman among educators, the Bernard Baruch of the schools. That's another guy, am I right? Many philosophers characterize Dewey's philosophy as superficial. This is as much a critique of the American mind at the beginning of the 20th century as it is of Dewey, for he voiced its impulses and its interests in faithful fashion. Increased interest in such thinkers as Kierkegaard and Niebuhr, as well as neo-Thomists, is an indication that American thought might be growing mature enough to discard Dewey as its spokesman. But he will remain, remember this is 1958, I think we've regressed since then. But he will remain an important figure historically in a way similar to Descartes for having broken so abruptly from traditional philosophy. For Dewey cast aside the traditional problems of philosophy as not deserving of attention, gave a revolutionary definition to truth, united knower to the object of knowledge in such a way as to destroy any proper autonomy of personal thought, and subjected rational activity to social engineering. Dewey pulled the philosopher out of his ivory tower and put him in the driver's seat of the social steam shovel. These are two different occupations, which Dewey refused to admit, and each has a valid function even in contemporary industrial society. There is a disturbing paradox behind the fact that in this age of specialization, the quote, typical American philosopher lumped together the functions of philosopher, educator, and social engineer in such fashion as to destroy the proper function of the thinker and the teacher by making them too social engineers. Interesting. Well, I would love to get to the conclusion, but it's rather lengthy. More lengthy than a normal episode. So I cannot do that because I have to go deal with that kid. But I look forward to next time having the conclusion to my conversation with the, I hate to say it, history homos, or as one of my favorite guests of his says, calls them history homo sapiens. So you can check out our discussion there when it's up, which should probably be in a week or so. Thank you for the many words of condolence and love that I have received for Joe Not a Fed. It's not the same to not have him in the chat, and he will be missed and loved. And it's always good to remember to pray for people who, you remember them right away. But let's try to remember a little longer some of these friends that we're losing. This is a bad year. But so that's it. And if you want to come to the CD Cognitive Dissonance Zoom party, this one, which is Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, or any other, shoot me an email, monicaperezshow@gmail.com. I'll tell you how to subscribe, or if you're already subscribed in one way or another, you should be able to get the Zoom link. Otherwise, if you email me there, I'll send it to you. So thank you for coming, and I'll see you again soon.